In Iran's case, a lot of its interference in Canadian affairs is not in our elections. It's transnational repression. It's intimidation of dissidents. It's pressure on human rights activists here, blackmailing, intimidation, threats to try to basically shut them up. Outside of the electoral process, more because of their human rights activism, their democratic activism with regards to Iran. So I think that, as we continue our debates inside Canada on what do we do about foreign interference, we need to give a bit more space, I think, a lot more space to that aspect.
Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. Thomas Juneau joins the pod today, this time for a wide-ranging discussion on Iran, from the impact of the death of President Raisi to recent Canadian sanctions and the Iran-Israel Cold War, which escalated in April with Iran's first direct attack on Israel since the Islamic Republic was established in 1979. Thomas Juneau is an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. Be sure to check out our new podcast, The Geopolitical Update, with CDA Deputy Director and former Director of Policy to Canada's Minister of National Defence, Joe Varner. Every Friday, Joe will provide in-depth analysis of the most significant geopolitical events of the week. Be sure to catch us this Friday morning. This is the Expert Series. Dr. Juneau, good to see you and great to have you on again. Thanks so much for accepting our invitation. There's a lot to unpack right now with Iran and the Canadian-Iranian relationship. Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi was recently killed in a helicopter crash, as you know, and this past month Canada has imposed further sanctions on Iran, all while tensions flare in the Middle East as the Israel-Hamas War enters its 9th month. So this is a bit of a scene setter for our discussion today. Why don't we start with the death of Iranian President Raisi? I'm wondering, Dr. Juneau, if you can explain what the immediate impact of his death has been and what the implications are for Iranian stability and regional stability.
Well, in the short term, pretty much every Iran watcher agrees that the death of Iran's president does not have a major impact. It does not have a major impact at all on the country's foreign policy, in the sense that the president in Iran is not the main player in foreign policy. It's the supreme leader. And around the supreme leader, there's key IRGC officers, a few others. The president matters. He's not insignificant, but he's far from the most important. The other thing to always remember is that Iran's government is heavily institutionalized, and with the exception of the supreme leader, personalities matter, but they fit into broader institutions. So when one personality goes, whether by death or some other reason, the system continues. So in terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic policy, for that matter, continuity is really what we can expect in the short term.
Would there be any impact on the internal dynamics of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps?
In the short term, not much. In beyond the short term, what is interesting is that the supreme leader, who is by far the most powerful individual in Iran, he's 85. He's had cancer in the past. At 85, his life expectancy can't be too long. So informally, there is a race to succeed him that has been undergoing for a few years now. Raisi was assumed to be one of the contenders in that race. Some analysts used to rate him as the top contenders. Others were a bit more skeptical, but he was a contender. And there was a movement among conservative and hardliner factions to try to line up behind him. So his death does mean that one of the contenders, if not necessarily the top one, is now gone. So there will be a lot of jockeying in the next months and years beyond the presidential election to try to see how the dynamics of leadership succession change. Raisi did tick a fair number of boxes to be potentially emerging as a consensus candidate among conservative factions, in the sense that he's obsequiously loyal to the supreme leader. He's blindly loyal to the regime. That was his main asset. But he was also not an especially strong character and personality. So for a lot of factions within the regime, including within the IRGC, but elsewhere too, he was not threatening. So in that sense, he could potentially have been a consensus candidate of loyal to the regime, ensuring continuity, but not threatening the position of key regime factions. And it's not clear to me, now that he's gone, who ticks all of these boxes anymore. So there will be a lot of jockeying to try to see who can emerge now as another top candidate.
Do we have any idea at this stage who the next successor could be?
For the two races, a lot of names are being thrown around. For the presidential race, which is on 28 June, so it's happening very quickly. As per the Iranian constitution, it has to be within 50 days of his death. A number of names have come up. We haven't had yet the approvals of candidates, right? Candidates can put forward their own names. Some of them have already done that. But then there's a body called the Guardian Council that is completely controlled by the Supreme Leader that has to approve their candidacies. So we don't have these answers yet. A number of names are being thrown around. Kalibaf, who has been mayor of Tehran, senior IRGC officer, Speaker of Parliament. He is a potential name. The risk with him is that he's a very strong personality. So it's not clear that he ticks the box of obsequiously loyal to the Supreme Leader. But he's definitely one name to watch. Ali Larijani, a former nuclear negotiator and Speaker of Parliament, also a prominent one. On the Supreme Leader side, what is very much an open race at this point, and obviously not a formal race yet because the Supreme Leader is not dead yet. The other name that was frequently mentioned as a top name in recent years is Mujtaba Khamenei, who is the son of the current Supreme Leader, which is really interesting when you think of it, because the Islamic Republic was born by overthrowing a dynastic monarchy, right? The Pahlavi monarchy. So the idea that you could have a dynastic succession now with the Supreme Leader being succeeded by his son is pretty striking. And there are some people who think that it could make sense because of the continuity dimension, but a lot of analysts, and I tend to be on that side, are more skeptical because of how destabilizing that could be.
Thanks, Dr. Juneau. Before we move on to a discussion on Canada-Iran relations, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts on the death of the president or maybe its impact.
Looking beyond the more domestic dimension that I discussed so far, looking at the foreign policy dimension, key point to emphasize in the short term, continuity. Don't expect change. One example that you can use to illustrate this is when Soleimani, you remember General Soleimani, who was the head of the Quds Force, which is kind of the special forces of the IRGC, was assassinated by the US in January 2020. The consequences of that, certainly in the short term, in terms of Iran's foreign policy, were negligible. He was a dominant personality, extremely charismatic, extremely connected through, in Lebanon, in Syria, and elsewhere where Iran supports non-state armed groups and terrorist groups and so on. But the IRGC is a big organization with with a very strong level of institutionalization. So in the short term, certainly, his death did not change the country's foreign policy. Raisi did not have the level of influence and reach and strong personality that Soleimani had 4.5 years ago now. So his death will not lead to significant changes in the country's foreign policy. If you go beyond the short term, if there is a leadership succession, if there is a period of instability, could that lead to some changes in the country's foreign policy? Not impossible, and that certainly is one scenario. That being said, to me, the most likely scenario when the leadership transition comes remains continuity. And if there is a period of instability that is accompanied by that, which is not impossible, to be clear, what that means in terms of foreign policy is very unpredictable. It could mean retrenchment, i.e. the regime retrenches from its foreign policy assertiveness to focus more on domestic troubles. But it could also mean entrenchment. It could also mean doubling down on foreign entanglements as a way of different leaders, trying to pursue more radical and reckless foreign policies as a way to showcase, their revolutionary credentials. And it could also mean, and I'll finish on this, doubling down on foreign commitments in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and in Yemen, the one that I follow a lot, as a way of sending a signal to adversaries, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the US, do not try to take advantage of our domestic uncertainty right now, because this would be the cost, right? Signaling that it would retaliate in Yemen or in Lebanon and so on. So all that to say, continuity is the most likely scenario, but could be some unpredictability in the long term.
Could you provide a brief overview of the current state of Iran-Canada relations and touch on some of the key issues in our relationship at present, particularly in light of the recent sanctions and recent diplomatic expulsions?
So the current state of Canada-Iran relations, not surprisingly, is not good. It's a conflictual, adversarial relationship at this point. Canada, in the last couple of years, has tightened up a number of sanctions against Iran using a variety of tools, and I think we'll break some of that down in another question. But one of the tools that Canada has started using now is something called the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. I'm not a lawyer. There's a level of technicality in explaining how that works that I'm not familiar with, but one of the rationales for using this tool is that there's been growing awareness in Canada in recent years as part of the broader debates that we're having on foreign interference and China, that transnational repression by the IRGC and Iran more broadly is a big problem in this country. You have Iranian officials, families of Iranian officials who come to Canada. Some of them park money in Canada. Some of them engage in transnational repression, i.e. targeting of dissidents, intimidation of dissidents, intimidation of the families of dissidents in Canada, or intimidation of their families in Iran, and so on. One of the tools that we started using more now through the IRPA is to try to kick out Iranian officials who are here, who have been, sending their families here, their kids to study, parking financial assets, investing in real estate. We've seen a fair bit of that in Toronto and Vancouver. Some of them are being kicked out. I think most would agree, and I certainly would, that it's far from enough. If you want to be glass half full, you can say that more is being done now than 2 years ago. That's nice, but there really is a need for Canada to tighten the grip a lot more on transnational repression by Iran, but for that matter, by other states too. And there's a nuance here, and I don't want to get into the broader debates on foreign interference, but a lot of the discussions that we've been having in this country on foreign interference have focused on the electoral dimension. China, India intervening in the electoral process. That matters, and it matters a lot, and I don't want to say that it doesn't. But perhaps we've been neglecting a bit too much the extent of foreign interference that happens outside of the electoral process, right? Sometimes it's a bit of a gray zone. It's not easy to make the distinction. But in Iran's case, a lot of its interference in Canadian affairs is not in our elections. It's transnational repression. It's intimidation of dissidents. It's pressure on human rights activists here, blackmailing, intimidation, threats to try to basically shut them up. Outside of the electoral process, more because of their human rights activism, their democratic activism with regards to Iran. So I think that, as we continue our debates inside Canada on what do we do about foreign interference, we need to give a bit more space, I think, a lot more space to that aspect.
The Canadian House of Commons passed a motion adding the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to an official list of terrorist organizations. I'm wondering if you might be able to explain the significance of or likely impact of this development.
So recently, the Canadian Parliament voted unanimously in favor of a motion in support of listing the IRGC as a terrorist organization. This is a non-binding motion. It does not mean anything concretely. It does not lead to that listing per se. It's an expression of the House of Commons will. It is very important that it was unanimous. It's not the first time that such a resolution passes. One of them passed pretty much exactly 6 years ago in the spring of 2018. What does that mean? Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I won't get into the technicalities, but as per the criminal code, there is such a thing called the list of terrorist entities. It includes groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and Al-Qaeda, and now a number of far-right groups as well. And when they are listed, that leads to a number of measures against them. There's a few things that have to get into this debate here, and to be clear, and I've been public about this on a number of occasions. I don't agree with Canada listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity, not because I like or support the IRGC, as you often hear on some of those fairly ridiculous debates on Twitter. To me, we need to do more to counter the IRGC, but listing it as a terrorist entity is not the smartest way to do that. It's not necessarily a bad way, but it's not the best way. I'll put aside the legal debate. A number of lawyers will tell you that actually it doesn't work because you're supposed to list non-state entities on this list, whereas the IRGC is the military of a state. Period. I mean, there shouldn't be any debate at that level. I'll let the lawyers debate on that one, but it is an important point to keep in mind in that debate. For me, the argument is more one of what is the smartest way to go ahead. Listing the IRGC as a whole is an extremely blunt and sweeping tool that leads to potential sanctions against the hundreds of thousands of individuals who've been conscripted in the IRGC in the past. To my mind, we're much better. It's a much better use of our scarce resources, because in the real world, our resources are really scarce. It's a much better use of our scarce resources to use targeted measures like the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, like the Special Economic Measures Act, like a number of other intelligence and law enforcement tools that we have that can be much more targeted, as opposed to the sweeping ones that to my mind and to the minds of a number of other experts, including some of my colleagues, is not effective. And keep in mind here that CSIS, the RCMP, CBSA, the Border Services Agency, they're overstretched, right? They don't have a large amount of spare capacity that they can simply shift towards something as broad as listing the IRGC. China, Russia, cyber, economic espionage, foreign interference, transnational repression, and the list goes on. Of other terrorism, obviously, of various kinds. So our resources are overstretched. So we do have to be very careful. And I really understand that this is not a popular argument in a lot of Iranian Canadian circles, where understandably the symbolism of listing the IRGC as a whole as a terrorist entity is very appealing. And I get that. But at the same time, we do have to be very mindful of how do we best use scarce resources. And to me, if we do share the common objective of doing more to counter IRGC activities in Canada, targeted measures are a better, smarter use of our resources.
Dr. Juneau, before we move on to the final topic of today, the Israel-Iran relationship, do you have any last thoughts in regard to our relationship with Iran?
Well, the Canada-Iran relationship has been conflictual since 1979. There was a lot of debate in 2012 when the Harper government closed our embassy. This is a move that I've opposed because I am firmly of the view that you have to talk to the bad guys. That's the point of diplomacy. You don't just have relations with your friends. You need to have a presence on the ground to monitor, to see what's going on, to talk to the bad guys. And to me, it's been a loss not to have that embassy. The Liberals tried to reopen that embassy in 2015 when they came to power. They did not succeed for a wide range of reasons. I've written a fair bit about that over the years. Now that file is closed. We don't have an embassy, and we're not going to have an embassy for the foreseeable future. Whether a government, this one or a future one, wants to open an embassy or not, because of the legacy of this failed effort to reopen, because of a number of measures that have been adopted by the Harper government and now new sanctions by the Trudeau government, there is simply no appetite, bandwidth on either side to do this. Some people will find this regrettable. Some people will find this a positive development. Ultimately, it is what it is, and that's the point we're at today. So moving forward on the Canadian side, our policy towards Iran will have to be done without an embassy on the ground, and obviously without an Iranian embassy here.
Thank you, Dr. Juneau. Iran, Israel. What would you say are the broader implications of the 2024 escalation of the Iran-Israel conflict for regional stability and international security? Within that, I'm wondering if you could touch on how the situation escalated back in April and what's happened since.
So, I started watching Iran in 2006 when I was with the Department of National Defense, where I stayed until 14. And then I've been a professor now for pretty much exactly 10 years at Ottawa U. And I've been fairly confident for 18 years now of watching Iran that there will not be a regional war with Iran. And by regional war, obviously, I mean open, all-out, hot war, direct war between Israel and the U.S., and Iran. Of course, there's been significant violence beneath the level of open warfare, gray zone, hybrid warfare, war between wars. People use a variety of labels. That happens, and that's a huge problem. I've been fairly confident in that assessment. It's come close, notably in 2020 after the U.S. assassinated Soleimani, and there was fear of escalation after that. It was pretty close. And then October 7th comes, the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel, and then Israel's war on Gaza that starts a bit after that. I've been cautiously optimistic, and I use the word optimistic with a bit of hesitation here, because it's hard to be optimistic with how this war is proceeding on every side. It's a disaster. But narrowly speaking, on the front of a Hezbollah Israel or Iran Israel or Iran US front, I've been cautiously optimistic that there would not be an escalation. Why? Because I think all sides understand that escalation is extremely destructive for all of them. We're not in the world of mutually assured destruction that we had in the Cold War between the nuclear-armed superpowers, US and USSR. But at a lesser level, we are in a similar dynamic in the sense that Iran certainly understands, and that is very clear to me, that escalation is not in its interest, because in the scenario of escalation, everybody suffers, but Iran loses. And that's clear to the leaders of Iran. On the Israeli side, there has been a fair bit of push by some in the government and around the government to escalate with Hezbollah to try to, quote unquote, solve the Hezbollah problem, and to escalate with Iran. But ultimately, cooler heads have prevailed on the Israeli side too. Certainly on the American side, there's an understanding that escalation and direct warfare with Iran would be extremely destabilizing and damaging to the region. And I'm fairly confident that that will hold. That being said, to come back to another aspect of your question, it was very close in April. Right, if you remember, Israel hits a facility next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus in early April, and then there's a series of tit-for-tat escalations that culminates in the large-scale Iranian attack on Israel, if I'm not mistaken, on 14 April, with about 300 drones and missiles. And if you think about it, 300 drones and missiles is a huge number. Some people will say, yes, but it was telegraphed in advance. Iran was very transparent. Iran gave time to Israel to prepare. All true. Israel was very ready. Israeli air defenses are among the best in the world. Israel can count on the help of allies, US, Israel, France, and the UK. Also, Jordan helped a lot. Not clear to which extent Saudi Arabia also helped. All true. That matters a lot. And that sent a very strong signal to Iran of the strength of Israeli defenses and the strength of its alliances. But 300 missiles and drones, that is a huge number. And only a couple of those would have gone through, hit civilian or urban areas, caused a large number of deaths among civilians, and we would be in a different world today. So my cautious assessment from the beginning that there will not be direct warfare really came close to collapse on 14 April, but ultimately it stood, and we have clearly seen de-escalation since. Things have changed a bit. We're not quite in the pre-April 14th world now. The baseline has changed because of the precedent of a large-scale direct Iranian attack on Israeli territory, which had never happened before. Indirect attacks, yes, of course, not a large-scale direct attack like this. So the red lines have changed. The rules of the game have changed a bit. I think we still need a bit of time to see the dust settle and the how the rules of the games are clarified. The rules of the game are very important. There have always been rules between Israel and Iran that are sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, sometimes they indirectly communicate to each other through Egypt, through Qatar, through others. But they both try to clarify to some extent, where they each stand. These rules have changed a bit, but they still stand. So ultimately, I don't want to say that I'm optimistic because the situation is a mess for a whole bunch of other reasons. But narrowly speaking, on that front, I think it will remain broadly stable in terms of no direct warfare.
Dr. Juneau, always a pleasure to have you on. The CDA values your thought leadership, and I look forward to having you on again soon. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned this Friday for the latest installment of the Geopolitical Update podcast hosted by Joe Barner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.